For a long time, she believed faith needed certainty to survive. She trusted God, but only when the path felt clear. She followed him, but only when the next step made sense. She believed, but always with the quiet hope that clarity would come first. Certainty felt safe. Certainty felt responsible. Certainty felt like proof that she wasn't risking too much. But faith kept asking for more. It asked her to move when she couldn't see the outcome, to trust when explanations were absent, to obey when reassurance didn't arrive. And that terrified her, not because she doubted God, but because she feared the unknown. She wanted guarantees, signs that everything would work out, assurance that she wouldn't be disappointed again, confirmation that the cost wouldn't be too high, that God was not offering certainty. He was offering himself, and that was the turning point. There came a moment when she realized that her need for certainty was quietly controlling her faith. She waited to feel ready. She waited to understand. She waited to feel safe. And faith waited too, not because God was absent, but because he was inviting her to trust him beyond understanding. Choosing faith over certainty was not reckless. It was relational. It meant trusting the heart of God. When the hand of God felt hidden, it meant believing that his presence was enough, even when his plans were unclear. She realized something profound. Certainty demands answers. Faith learns to live without them. Certainty wants guarantees. Faith rests in character. Certainty asks, will this work out? Faith asks, is God still with me? And in that realization, she stood at a crossroads. She could wait for clarity that might never come, or she could choose faith that would carry her forward even in the dark. She chose faith. Not because she was fearless, but because she was tired of letting uncertainty keep her stuck. She chose faith because she finally understood that certainty is fragile, but God is faithful. If you've ever felt paralyzed by the need to understand everything, if you've waited for answers before taking a step, if you've loved God but struggled to move forward without guarantees, stay. This message is for the woman who is learning that faith does not begin when certainty arrives. It begins when certainty is released. And if these words already feel familiar, like something God has been whispering to you, consider subscribing. Not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when faith asks you to walk forward without knowing exactly where the path leads. Now, let's walk through what changes when she chooses faith over certainty. Certainty gave her something faith never promised: control. With certainty, she could plan. With certainty, she could prepare. With certainty, she could protect herself from disappointment, from loss, from regret. Certainty made life feel manageable, predictable, contained. Faith, on the other hand, felt exposed. Faith asked her to move without knowing the full picture, to obey without seeing the outcome, to trust without holding proof in her hands. And that felt risky. She told herself she was just being cautious, that waiting for clarity was wisdom, that asking questions was responsible. But beneath that caution was fear. Fear of choosing wrong. Fear of being hurt again. Fear of stepping forward and discovering she misunderstood God. Fear of trusting fully and finding herself alone in the outcome. Certainty protected her from those fears, or at least it felt like it did. So she waited. She waited for signs. She waited for confirmation. She waited for the feeling of readiness that never quite arrived. And while she waited, life remained suspended. Not because God was silent, but because certainty had become the gatekeeper of her obedience. She didn't realize it at first, but certainty had quietly taken the place. That trust was meant to occupy. She trusted God's goodness, but only once she could see how things would unfold. She believed in His guidance, but only when the next step felt safe. She followed, but only when the cost was clear. God saw this tension, not with frustration, but with patience, because He knew that certainty feels safer. When wounds are still tender, when disappointment is still fresh, when unanswered prayers still echo, He knew her heart wasn't resisting Him. It was protecting itself. But protection has a cost. Certainty kept her from risk, but it also kept her from movement. It shielded her from pain. It also blocked growth. It promised safety, but quietly demanded stagnation. Faith, however, offered something different. Not safety, but companionship. Not clarity, but presence. Not control, but trust. God was not asking her to abandon wisdom. He was asking her to release the illusion that understanding everything was the same as trusting Him. Because certainty can explain, but it cannot carry. Faith may not explain, but it walks with you. And slowly, she began to see the truth. The safety she was clinging to was keeping her from the life God was inviting her into. Certainty had become a shelter, but also a ceiling. And the moment she recognized that, something inside her began to shift. She started wondering if the risk she feared might actually be the place where faith would finally grow. There came a moment, not sudden, not dramatic, when she noticed something quietly unsettling. She wasn't waiting on God. She was waiting on certainty. She had told herself she was being patient, that she was discerning, that she was waiting for the right timing. But beneath that language was a truth she could no longer ignore. Certainty had become a condition for obedience. She was willing to follow God once everything made sense. She was ready to step forward once the risks were clear. She was open to His will once the outcome felt safe. And that realization humbled her, because obedience, by its nature, does not wait for certainty. God had never promised that His path would be predictable. He had promised that He would be present. She began to see it in the stories she had read her whole life, but never fully recognized herself in. Abraham did not know where he was going. Peter did not know what would happen when he stepped out of the boat. Mary did not know how everything would unfold. They had questions, they had fear, they had uncertainty, but they moved anyway. Not because they understood, but because they trusted. And suddenly, she saw her own hesitation more clearly. She wasn't disobedient. She wasn't rebellious. She wasn't indifferent. She was cautious to the point of stillness. And stillness, when God is inviting movement, becomes delay. God had been whispering, not shouting, "Take the step. Release what you're holding. Trust me here." But she kept asking for confirmation, for reassurance, for proof that the step would be worth it. And God, in His patience, waited, not because He needed to convince her, but because He respects the pace at which trust grows. Yet in that waiting, she began to feel the cost, the restlessness, the sense of being stuck, the quiet frustration. That came from knowing God was near, but feeling unable to move. Certainty had promised protection, but it was producing paralysis. And then gently, God revealed a truth that reframed everything. Obedience does not follow certainty. Certainty follows obedience. Understanding comes after trust, not before it. Clarity is often the fruit of stepping forward, not the prerequisite. She realized that waiting for certainty was not keeping her safe. It was keeping her from growth. God was not withholding answers. He was inviting relationship. He wasn't asking her to understand everything. He was asking her to walk with him, and that changed the question entirely. Instead of asking, "Will this work out?" she began to ask, "Is God asking me to trust him here?" Instead of waiting, to feel ready, she began to notice. Where God was already present, she understood then that faith does not move once the fog clears. Faith moves because God is in the fog too. And in that realization, certainty began to lose its authority. Not because uncertainty felt comfortable, but because obedience was finally calling her forward. Choosing faith over certainty did not make the questions disappear. It changed how she carried them. She still didn't know how everything would unfold. She still couldn't see the full road ahead. She still felt the pull of fear. When outcomes felt fragile, but something inside her shifted. She stopped demanding answers before taking steps. She stopped asking God to explain himself before she trusted him. She stopped believing that clarity was the proof of safety. She realized that faith was never meant to eliminate uncertainty. It was meant to teach her how to walk through it. And so she took a step. Not confidently, not boldly, but obediently. She moved with questions in her heart and trust in her hands. She obeyed while still afraid. She walked forward, without guarantees. This kind of courage did not come from personality. It came from relationship. She trusted God, not because she knew what he would do, but because she knew who he was. She remembered the moments he had already carried her, through confusion, through loss, through seasons she thought would break her. She realized something profound. God had never failed her, even when she didn't understand him. So she stepped forward, with trembling faith. Faith that didn't shout, faith that didn't demand certainty. Faith that simply said, "I don't see the way, but I trust the one who does." She learned that obedience does not always feel peaceful at first. Sometimes it feels vulnerable, exposed, risky. But she also learned that God meets his daughters in the movement of trust. Not at the finish line, not once everything makes sense, but in the very act of stepping forward. As she moved, something unexpected happened. The fear did not grow, it softened. The uncertainty did not disappear, but it lost its power, because she was no longer standing alone at the edge of the unknown. God was with her, in the step. Choosing faith over certainty did not give her answers. It gave her companionship, and that was enough. As she continued walking forward, she noticed something subtle but powerful. Her faith was changing. It was no longer fragile, dependent on reassurance, no longer anxious, searching for signs, no longer restless, waiting for certainty to arrive. Her faith was becoming steady. Not because the path became clear, but because her dependence shifted. She stopped measuring faith by how confident she felt. She stopped judging trust by how calm her emotions were. She stopped believing that doubt disqualified her obedience. She learned that faith does not require emotional certainty. It requires relational trust. There were days when questions returned, moments when fear whispered again, nights when the unknown felt heavy. But those moments no longer stopped her, because faith was no longer anchored in understanding. It was anchored in God. She began to see uncertainty not as an enemy, but as a place where trust could grow deeper. When she didn't understand, she prayed instead of panicking. When she felt unsure, she rested instead of retreating. When she feared the future, she remembered the past, how God had already been faithful, in ways she could not have predicted. Faith matured in her, not as certainty, but as confidence in God's character. She trusted him, without needing him to explain himself. And that changed everything. Her obedience became freer, her peace became quieter, her steps became steadier. She no longer needed God to remove the fog. She trusted that he was walking with her, inside it. Faith became less about answers and more about presence. Less about outcomes and more about relationship. Less about control and more about surrender. And in that shift, she realized something sacred. Choosing faith over certainty did not weaken her life, it strengthened it, because certainty collapses when circumstances change, but faith rests on a God who does not. In the end, she did not receive all the answers she once demanded, but she received something better. She received trust, a trust that did not depend on outcomes, a faith that did not wait, FOR explanations, a peace that did not require everything to make sense. She learned that God never promised certainty. He promised presence, and that promise proved to be enough. She stopped asking, "Will this work out?" and began asking, "Is God with me here?" She stopped waiting to feel ready. She stopped delaying obedience. She stopped asking faith to feel safe. Instead, she chose to walk, not boldly, not fearlessly, but faithfully. Choosing faith over certainty did not remove her questions. It placed them in the hands of a faithful God, and that freed her to live. If this message spoke to you, if you've been waiting for clarity before taking a step, if you've been holding back because you wanted guarantees, if you felt God inviting you forward, but fear kept you still, let this be your reminder. Faith does not begin when certainty arrives. Faith begins when you trust God without it. If you want a place to return when the path feels unclear and your heart needs grounding, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for your journey. Because the God who calls you forward does not wait for you to understand everything. He walks with you as you learn to trust him.